Thank you very much. It's an honor to be introduced by one of the outstanding students of Georgetown University. As Maya indicated, I've served 8 United States presidents from John F. Kennedy to Bill Clinton. And you get prominent if you live long enough. In fact, there's a joke in the Middle East that I'm so old that I remember the Dead Sea when it was only sick. I want to share with you a Georgetown anecdote. In 1992, when I was the Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, and I held that position under George Bush 41 and Bill Clinton, my alma mater, the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and that makes my presence here personally very meaningful, asked me to give the commencement address and to grant me an honorary degree at Georgetown University, which I humbly but very gratefully accepted. Now, in 1992, I happened to be the highest-ranking Georgetown Foreign Service School graduate in the federal government, and I was only an Assistant Secretary of State. Now, you all remember what happened in November of 1992. A fellow by the name of Bill Clinton got elected President of the United States, and all of a sudden, Georgetown's Foreign Service School went from an Assistant Secretary of State as its senior graduate to the President of the United States. And I was very hurt by my alma mater because ever since Bill Clinton was elected president, they always called him back to give major speeches, and they never called me back. I told this to Bill Clinton, President Clinton, and he got a big kick out of that. What I'd like to do this evening is to briefly give you an overview, which is really part of the main message of this book I wrote that was published in September by Simon & Schuster that was mentioned, Danger and Opportunity, an overview of an American diplomat's perspective of U.S. foreign policy toward the Arab and the Muslim world. And I want to hasten to say, when I use the term Muslim world, I am talking about a mosaic and not a monolith, like Vartan Gregorian writes in his book, because Muslim world is merely a generalization. As we well know, especially this audience knows, the Muslim world is highly differentiated, highly diverse. Only 20% of the Muslim world are Arabs, 80% live outside the Arab world. And so one cannot speak of the Muslim world as a monolith, but it is a very diverse part of our global population. The challenges that the Obama administration faces in its foreign policy toward the Arab and Muslim world are apparently great. And I think it is very important for our new president in the United States to what I call to connect the dots of the major issues in what one can call the Greater Middle East. And what I mean by the Greater Middle East is from the Maghreb through the Levant to the Gulf and into Iran, and I include in the Greater Middle East a part of South Asia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, which is so critical in terms of crisis, the crises that we face. There are many hot issues, as we painfully know. The central one remains the Arab-Israeli conflict, the issue of Palestine, the unresolved peacemaking between Israelis and Palestinians, between Israel and Syria, and Israel and Lebanon. The situation in Lebanon, the tragic situation we've seen in Gaza recently, how to deal with Hezbollah, how to deal with Hamas. The end game, at least in terms of United States involvement in Iraq, how is the situation in Iraq going to evolve? hopefully in a stable manner and not in an unstable manner, which will have vast implications for the region if it does go badly. Iran, which is becoming such a major issue, at least in the United States, as one of the major challenges that U.S. policy faces in the region. And of course, Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I also add into that Kashmir. We often forget about Kashmir, but Kashmir is a critical, unresolved conflict situation that has the potential, the horrible potential, of bringing two nuclear weapon states to war. And let us not forget that Pakistan and India have gone to war 3 times since their independence, and that one cannot diminish the prospects of a dangerous situation escalating between these two countries. So you could see that the region is fraught with critical issues, unresolved, that need the attention of the people of the region in the first instance, but also hopefully the constructive involvement of the outside world. Overarching all of these specific issues, in my view, is the struggle of ideas within the Muslim world. And by that I mean the struggle between the forces of moderation and the forces of extremism, and in the middle, those, especially the younger generations, who haven't made up their mind which way to go. This is a struggle of ideas that will determine the future of the Arab world and the countries of the Muslim world. And is hopefully, of course, my prejudice and those, I think, most people in the Muslim world, that the forces of moderation prevail and that the Islamic radicals are marginalized so that this very important part of the world can evolve to meet what the Arab UNDP reports that you all know about underline: the education deficit in the Arab world, the political deficit, the economic deficit, that the structural problems that this region faces to construct societies that are responsive to the needs of the people, creating jobs, reforming the educational system, building infrastructure, and democratizing the Middle East according, and this is very important, not according to an American model or any outside model, but really expanding political participation according to the culture of this region and the specific traditions of each country. Certainly, when I was sitting in Washington, I made sure that our diplomats in the Middle East, they differentiated. You cannot deal with Lebanon the same way you deal with Saudi Arabia. You cannot deal with certain Gulf countries the same way you deal with Egypt, etc. Differentiation is very important because of the diversity of this part of the world. So in connecting the dots, I think, are going to be very important for the Obama administration. To tell you the truth, we have never succeeded in Washington, be it in Democratic or Republican administrations, to elaborate a comprehensive, coherent policy toward the region as a whole, unfortunately. And while I say I hope the Obama administration will connect the dots, that doesn't mean that these issues are inextricably linked. But it does mean that what you do in the Israeli-Palestinian equation will have some impact on what happens in Iraq, in Iran, in Pakistan, and beyond, and vice versa. What we elaborate as our Iran policy will have an impact on the Levant and obviously Afghanistan and Pakistan. So we have to have, in the first instance, the proper analysis of the issues we're dealing with, and then to formulate policies that are coherent and comprehensive. One of the major messages I have in my book is that I hope, and the book starts with an open letter to the President, the new President of the United States, is that American policy toward this part of the world should move from conflict management to conflict resolution. What do I mean by that? In other words, instead of just being reactive to the inevitable crises that erupt, 2006, the Israeli-Lebanese Hezbollah crisis, which was a very serious crisis. Just recently, the crisis in Gaza. These crises erupt. We go in like fire engines and the fire brigades, put out the fires, but then we don't, in a sustained and coherent manner, make a major effort to resolve the core issues. And I think that it would be a much wiser policy for any American administration, in this instance the Obama administration, to really be able to move from conflict management to conflict resolution. Now, the central political issue in the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli is the Arab-Israeli conflict and the issue of Palestine. We must recognize the centrality of the Palestinian issue and its symbolism throughout the Arab world and beyond in the Muslim world. I think the neoconservatives in the previous American administration made a terrible error of strategic analysis of advocating that the road to peace in the Middle East is not really through Jerusalem and Israel negotiating peace with its immediate Arab neighbors, but the road to peace is through Baghdad, through Tehran. In other words, regime change, establishing democratic regimes in this part of the world, which would then make it easier to negotiate peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors. I think that was a very faulty concept. And one of the major themes I have in my book is that the road to Arab-Israeli peace goes through Jerusalem in direct negotiations between Israel and its immediate Arab neighbors. It does not go through Tehran. It does not go through Baghdad. There are connectivities, of course, but each one of these issues has to be dealt with on its own merits. I was very much involved in the Bush 41 administration when I was ambassador to Syria, to Damascus, and also as Assistant Secretary of State in the elaboration of what became known as the Madrid Peace Conference. What is the distinction of the Madrid Peace Conference? Why was it such a breakthrough? It was a major breakthrough because it's the first time in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict since 1948 that we were able, in the international community, to get the Israelis and Israel's Arab neighbors to sit down and negotiate in direct, face-to-face negotiations. Before that time, there was always the intermediaries and the UN and third parties, but this was a comprehensive approach in which Israel sat at the table with all of its Arab immediate neighbors, and beyond that, representatives of the Gulf Arab states, the Maghreb, the United Nations, the European Union. And the principal position was land for peace, under the aegis of the two key United Nations Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. That principled position of Madrid remains to this day the framework under which any further peace agreements between Israel and its Arab neighbors can be constructed. Now, the good news is that since 1991, there have been failures, as we know, in the peace negotiations. And by the way, I hate the word peace process. And why do I hate that word, that term peace process? Because process is something that goes on forever. And you build up a contingency. It's a great phrase for full employment of diplomats forever. But we want resolution. So that's why I talk about peace talks and peace negotiations and not a peace process. What we need is, under the aegis of the Madrid Peace Conference, to bring the talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the Israelis and the Syrians, and Lebanon will follow very, very closely in lockstep with progress on both these other fronts, is basically to build on the negotiations that have taken place since 1991. 80%, at least 80% of the key issues in the Israeli-Syrian negotiations have been thoroughly negotiated and discussed by Israel and Syria under the honest interlocutor role, broker role of the United States. 80% of the issues on land, the Golan Heights, normalization of relations, peace, security arrangements, and access to water. These four major categories of the negotiations have been extensively negotiated, and that legacy is there. And what I'm suggesting here is that if the Israeli-Syrian negotiations are resumed, they are not starting from ground zero. The Israeli-Palestinian talks, as difficult as they are, and with the frustrating lack of progress that we've seen in recent years, and the tragedy in Gaza and on the ground on both sides, there have been extensive talks between the parties, and the general contours of an Israeli-Palestinian settlement are there. And they're basically known to the parties. But what is going to be incredibly difficult is the demonstration of political will on the part of the Arab leaders and the Israeli leaders and the United States president and the American leadership and the foreign community, the international community, to bring those negotiations to a final resolution and what I call conflict resolution. It's going to take a great deal of political courage. And we will have to see if the political will manifest itself in the next few years to be able to bring these negotiations forward and hopefully to a conclusion. But again, if you look at the Israeli-Palestinian situation, I was very struck about 5 years ago, and I was ambassador to Israel from 1993 to 1994 when Yitzhak Rabin was prime minister. And in my subsequent visits to Israel, I was really surprised in my private talks what I was hearing from Likud leaders. Now, Likud, as you know, is the right-wing conservative party of Israel, and it looks like the current Likud leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, will probably be forming the next government of Israel, and it probably will be, if they can't succeed in a national unity government, it'll probably be a right-wing coalition. But what struck me in my private talks with then people like Libby Livni, with Ariel Sharon, and others, was that they were talking, and these are Likud leaders. If I was hearing this from a Yossi Beilin in the Labor Party or Shimon Peres, I would not give it the importance I attached to hearing this from Likud leaders. And that was basically that they realized that given what I call the geopolitics of demography in the region, that in the next 20 to 30 years, if you look at the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea where Israel is located, the Jewish population is going to become a very, very increasingly small minority. And therefore, if Israel is going to remain a democratic Jewish state, because that is the identity of Israel, a democratic Jewish state, it cannot remain Jewish if the demographic forces continue and there is still no settlement between Israel and its Arab partners. And it cannot remain democratic if it continues to occupy 3 to 4 million Palestinians. So when Likud leaders began to talk to me in private at that time, that the only solution, the viable solution for Israel to remain a democratic Jewish state is separation, either and preferably by negotiated peace agreements with our Arab neighbors for a two-state solution, an independent state of Palestine living in peace and security with the state of Israel. So if it could be negotiated and the negotiating partners were there, that was the optimal way to move forward. But if it could not be negotiated, then Israel would have to consider unilateral withdrawal. And of course, Sharon did that. There was a sea change in Sharon's position when he was outside in opposition, and then when he became prime minister, he saw that the destiny and the future of Israel was at peril. And so he opted for the separation. He separated unilaterally in Gaza, and we saw the consequences of that. Unilateral separation doesn't work because the other side has no commitments. There's no agreement. So the Israeli forces withdrew from Gaza, and we saw what happened ever since. The same thing in Lebanon. In 2000, when the Israeli armed forces withdrew from southern Lebanon, there was no bilateral agreement, and that's when Ehud Barak was prime minister. And we had the continuing conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. So in my view, unilateral separation is not the solution, but negotiated separation, two-state solution, is the way out. And the contours of that are pretty well known in a two-state solution, and what needs to be done about Jerusalem, what needs to be done about the settlements, where the border would be, the June 4th, 67 lines, etc. But I do not want to underestimate the incredibly difficult challenge it is politically to get to a final agreement. So hopefully we will see within the next 5 years the political will on both sides to get it through. If not, we're going to see increasing turmoil, conflict, and feeding the forces of extremism, because the extremists will exploit the Arab-Israeli issue and the Palestinian issue for their own political ends. And remember, for Al-Qaeda and the Osama bin Ladens of the world, the near enemy are the established regimes in the Arab world and in the Muslim world. They consider these regimes impious. And the far enemy are countries like mine, Europe, Israel, etc. And the lack of resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict only feeds the forces of extremism. Now, Iraq. Well, first, let me say, I think President Obama's made a very wise decision in the choice of his presidential emissary to deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict, George Mitchell. I believe in my eyes, he's an honest interlocutor. He has had success in the Good Friday Accords and being the key negotiator for the Irish problem. He understands the other. He understands the Arab side. He understands the Israeli side. So I think that's been a very enlightened choice. Now, Iraq. I was a senior policy advisor to the Iraq Study Group. That's former Secretary Baker and Lee Hamilton co-chaired. It was the only bipartisan consensus on the way forward in Iraq that we produced our report in 2006. Unfortunately, that report was not embraced fully by the administration or even Congress. And therefore, I think we lost an opportunity to bring America together, Democrats and Republicans, on a way forward in 2006 on Iraq. But in any case, many of the recommendations, we had 79 recommendations in that report, many of those have been followed. But the one recommendation that was not followed was our third major recommendation for a new diplomatic offensive in the Middle East. In other words, we said what we have to do inside of Iraq to promote national reconciliation between Sunnis, Shias, Kurds, Turkmens, Chaldeans, the other groups, lead to good governance, and then third, to establish security on the ground, had to be fortified by a new diplomatic offensive. And that new diplomatic offensive really meant engaging Iraq's neighbors, such as Iran, Syria, and the Gulf countries, the Arab countries, Russia, China, to really reinforce the internal goals of national reconciliation, security, and governance in Iraq. The administration did not follow our major recommendation to engage Syria and Iran. I am a staunch advocate of engaging your adversaries. After all, what is diplomacy about? You don't have to negotiate peace with your friends. You have to negotiate peace with your enemies. You have to engage your adversaries. And certainly Iran and Syria in the Middle East are two countries in which we must really enter into a strategic dialogue where everything is put on the table and to determine whether or not there is common ground. And the lack of having a strategic dialogue with countries like Iran and Syria have a high price, not only in terms of not resolving conflicts, but I was struck when Secretary Baker and I have this in my book, when we met with the Iranians. I was struck by the misperceptions that the Iranians had about our policy. For example, they actually thought that the United States, can I ask you to turn that off, please? When the United States was supporting, obviously, the central government in Baghdad, Maliki's government, the Iranians actually thought that we were not truly supporting Maliki. They thought we had another candidate that was anti-Iranian. Absolutely baseless. Absolutely baseless. But that small example illustrated to me the risks of not engaging your adversaries, because they were going on the premise that our support for the central government of Baghdad was theater, it wasn't real. And you can imagine how this informed their policy and their reactions. So I think on the question of Iraq, I think President Obama is seized with the issue of an orderly withdrawal of American troops while encouraging the national reconciliation, while encouraging the Iraqis to assume the security role more and more, and by engaging our Iraq's neighbors. President Obama has come out for a strategic dialogue with Syria and Iran, certainly with Iran, and there have been, and I think if he does pursue that, American foreign policy will be well served. Iran. I have two views on Iran. One, not two views, but two comments, basic comments. First of all, Iran is a very, obviously, important regional power in the Gulf, in the Middle East. It has a rich history, the Persian Empire. It has its role to play in the region. Iran, since 1979, has a theocratic government with the Vilayat al-Fiqh, and at the same time, a very vibrant parliamentary democracy where people do vote, and a lot of young people vote, and women vote. So Iran is a very complex political structure, and it has a very important influence in the region. So we should engage Iran because we have a lot of interests in common, especially if you look at Iraq, you look at Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, Pakistan, the United States, energy issues. The United States and Iran have a lot of common interests. What I have proposed is that the administration enter into a strategic dialogue with Iran where everything is put on the table. But the one thing that the United States at the beginning has to take off the table is regime change. We should get out of the business of regime change. How can you expect a country like Iran to negotiate in full faith with us if there is a suspicion that part of American policy is regime change? Put everything on the table, including very near the top, the nuclear weapons issue, and let the Iranians know what our agenda is. Ask them to agree to that agenda and whatever issues they want to put on the agenda. And let's move forward to see if there is common ground between the United States and Iran. This is critical. And I'm not an advocate of negotiations just as a pro forma thing to get them out of the way and then go to increase sanctions and then military action. I think military action in Iran would be a true failure of foreign policy. It's an option that nobody takes off the table, and no one should take off the table. But at the same time, every effort must be made to negotiate these differences, because the implications would be huge. So hopefully with Iran, we will be able to enter into this strategic dialogue. If we go to Afghanistan and Pakistan, American foreign policy in this part of the world has not been sustained, has not had a coherent focus, and that's been one of our big mistakes. If you remember in 1979, I remember this very well, I was the head of the political section in our embassy in Moscow when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. It was a turning point in our relationship with the Soviet Union. And of course, you know what we did from the outside. We supported the Mujahideen to put the pressure on the Soviet troops in Afghanistan and to make life intolerable for the Soviet military. And it worked very well. It worked only too well. And we succeeded. And then once the Soviet troops withdrew, we withdrew. And we virtually sublet our policy to others in Afghanistan, including the Pakistanis, including some elements in Saudi Arabia. And what was created in the aftermath of Afghanistan was Al-Qaeda, who then visited us on September 11th, 2001. And this is the principle of unintended consequences, at least in foreign policy. The same thing happened in 2003 when we took our military action against Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein. We got so involved in Iraq that most of our Middle East policy in the Bush administration, the energy that Iraq took out of our foreign policy was so great that we ignored other vital foreign policy interests of the United States, including Afghanistan and Pakistan. And now we have a situation where the Taliban is back, Al-Qaeda is there and active, and we have a real crisis situation where President Obama has to look and pay attention to Afghanistan as a major focal point of U.S. crisis management. And what we do in Afghanistan, again, I think we have to learn that nobody in history has been able to govern and control Afghanistan. And therefore, I think we should lower our goals in Afghanistan, do everything we can to help the Afghans themselves establish the security forces and the military to provide the modicum of security that's needed on the ground, so that the government in Kabul can extend public services to the Afghan citizens, schools, health clinics, roads, governance that will help marginalize the warlords, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. And we cannot eliminate all of the Taliban, and there are now these discussions whether or not there'll be discussions with the Taliban to see which ones can be weaned away or which ones can be dealt with, and that's fine, in my view. But there's no military solution alone to the situation in Afghanistan. General Eikenberry, who's just been named ambassador, told me, and I mentioned this in the book, that where the roads end in Afghanistan, the Taliban begins. And what he meant by that is where economic and social development, where government services, where government security ends, the Taliban begins. So in Afghanistan, it's a race against the ability of the central government to extend governance to its people, good governance, and the radicals, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, the warlords. So it's going to be a long struggle. There is not a short and easy fix. Pakistan, again, a nuclear weapons state. is going through great internal domestic turmoil now. I think the hope is to be able to get these secular political parties in Pakistan to agree to coalition governance, not resorting to violence, the military playing a role of stabilizer and guardian of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, but not becoming the kingmakers in the political system, no coups d'etats, but allow the political structure in Pakistan to evolve so that civilian governments can control the country, govern more wisely, create jobs, and begin to marginalize the extremists. But we have to maintain a sustained focus on Pakistan and Afghanistan and not turn our backs, because if we do, the bad actors will be back and we will fail. And now is a real problem in terms of what will be done in Lebanon to bring the forces together in some sort of agreement between the opposition parties and the government, and what you do with Hezbollah. My own view in the long term is that groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, if the politics of reconciliation are wisely followed in these countries, that these radical groups, we must try to bring them into the political process without destroying that very process. In 1992, again when I was Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs, I gave a speech called the Meridian House speech, which is detailed in the book. And the reason I gave that speech was I was getting very concerned. In 1992, we saw the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the collapse of communism, and then there were these theories that were going around in academic circles and policy pundits and others that all the ideological wars are over, we have defeated fascism, we've defeated communism. Fukuyama came out with his book, The End of History, that the world will become a little boring now, everyone's going to become a liberal democracies. Wrong. Wrong. The ideological struggles were not over, the war of ideas were not over. We saw Al-Qaeda, we saw extremism in various aspects. But we unilaterally started to disengage and dismantle our forces of persuasion in the United States. And we paid a price for that because our public diplomacy suffered. And I think public diplomacy is very important. And I have a chapter on public diplomacy in the book on what America has to do to regain its voice in the Arab and the Muslim world. And that's a separate issue that we don't have time to go in tonight. But in that speech, I made a very controversial statement because you remember in 1992, in Algeria, there were impending elections. And the FIS, the Islamic Salvation Front, if those elections were held, most likely would have come to power. We in Washington were very concerned about an Islamic radical party coming to power in Algeria, a very important country in the Maghreb, hydrocarbons, natural gas, oil, and what it would do to Morocco, Tunisia, and even Egypt. So in a statement I made in a speech which became rather infamous was that while the United States is for one person, one vote, in Arabic they translated one man, one vote. I said one person to include women, but it was translated in Arabic into one man, one vote. I said while the United States is for one man, one vote, the United States is not for one man, one vote, one time. And what we mean by that is that if a radical party comes to power, using the democratic process to come to power, and then once in power, destroys that very democratic process to stay in power, that is not our concept of democracy. And this is still the challenge we face in the greater Muslim world. Are those radical parties or extremist parties who can use the democratic process of elections to come to power, but then once in power, monopolize power. And that is one of the challenges of democratization. I am not an advocate of the United States promoting democracy by sending troops to overthrow regimes. That, I think, is a failed model. We don't know what's going to happen in Iraq. Inshallah, that Iraq will emerge as a democratic entity in the future, and all of this bloodshed and treasure will have a good end. And I hope for that. But as I state, you cannot parachute a Jeffersonian model of democracy into the sands of Arabia. What we should be doing is promoting the concept of democracy according to the cultures of the countries we're dealing with. For example, in Saudi Arabia, in '92, I recommended in this speech, which I'm not saying that he read the speech and did it, but then Crown Prince and now King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia is expanding the powers of the Majlis al-Shura as a more representative group. And I said in that speech, instead of trying to impose democracy, we should be encouraging the Saudis to expand the Majlis al-Shura, make it more broadly represented, and one day to make it elective, that the members of the Majlis al-Shura will be elected by the people. So he has made this decision years later. But again, I think that is the model that the United States should use in promoting democracy in the Arab and the Muslim world. Look at the culture, the political culture you're dealing with. Lebanon is obviously different than Saudi Arabia. Egypt is different than Saudi Arabia. But look at each country individually and see how we can help build the institutions of democracy from the ground up, and let the people decide, the people of the region decide their fate. So I think on these notes I will stop. My own view, and the reason for the title of the book is Danger and Opportunity, and it's interesting, why did I choose that title? When I was ambassador to Damascus, and on the eve of Desert Storm, when we took military action in Kuwait, the United States built, as you remember, this broad-based coalition of European, Russian, Arab states to reverse Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. It was true multilateral diplomacy under Bush 41 and Secretary Baker. I was instructed to see the ambassadors in Damascus, who were permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, to encourage them to support the UN resolution authorizing the military action against Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. So I visited the Chinese ambassador, and when I told him that we were going to go to war in Kuwait, and he listened very respectfully, and he said, yes, we know, and we will be supportive. But then he said, you know, Ambassador Djererjian, do you know what the word in Chinese is for crisis? We are entering a crisis. The word for Chinese in crisis is two characters in the Chinese language, one next to another one. One is danger, and one is opportunity. So the Chinese word for crisis is danger and opportunity. So right now, what I've explained to you is the multitude of dangers that we have to help resolve in the Middle East, but in all of this, there's a great opportunity to construct a better world, a better Middle East. And a lot of that can be done by soft power. I mean, what we see here in Qatar, I've just led a delegation from the Baker Institute here to Education City. In the Qatar Foundation, we had an international stem cell policy conference here. When I see Education City, the importance given to education as a building block of an Arab society. Let's not forget that Islamic society reached its heights as the conveyor of education and knowledge to the West. It was way back into the 13th century. And I think the Arab world can regain this position by concentrating, like their highnesses here in Qatar are certainly doing, in promoting education as a bulwark of society and democratic development. So there are opportunities, and we should seize them. But at the same time, we need political courage to resolve these crises I mentioned. Thank you very much for your attention.